Edward Hastings was a man whose name was synonymous with success. His towering office building in the heart of the city was a testament to his hard work and ambition. Every morning, before the sun even rose, Edward would be up and dressed in one of his perfectly tailored suits, his mind already buzzing with the day's tasks. He lived for the thrill of business, for the rush that came with closing a deal or launching a new project. To him, work was not just a necessity. It was a passion, an obsession. Edward's mornings were always the same. He'd step into his luxury car, which waited for him in the driveway of his sprawling suburban mansion. The driver would silently navigate through the early morning traffic, while Edward flipped through emails and reviewed reports on his tablet. By the time he arrived at his office, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city. Edward would step into his office, a sleek, modern space filled with the latest technology and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city below. The office was more than just a workplace. It was a sanctuary where Edward felt completely in control. Here, he was the master of his universe, making decisions that impacted thousands of people. His staff revered him, seeing him as a visionary leader who could turn any challenge into an opportunity, and Edward thrived on that respect. He was always the first to arrive and the last to leave, his days a blur of meetings, phone calls, and strategic planning. The hustle and bustle of the office, the constant flow of ideas, and the pressure to outperform drove him to keep pushing the boundaries of what he could achieve. But while Edward was conquering the business world, his personal life was falling apart. His wife, Laura, a beautiful and compassionate woman who had once been his closest confidant, now spent most of her days alone in their enormous house. She had long ago stopped waiting up for him, knowing that his late-night returns were inevitable. The love between them, once so vibrant, had withered under the weight of Edward's work. They still cared deeply for each other, but the connection that had once been the foundation of their marriage was now frayed and fragile. Laura often found herself reminiscing about the early days of their relationship, when Edward was a young entrepreneur with big dreams, but always made time for her. They had shared so many moments of joy and laughter, but now those memories felt like a lifetime ago. Laura had tried to talk to Edward about the growing distance between them, but each time she did, he would assure her that it was only temporary, that once this next deal was closed or this new project launched, he would have more time for her and the kids. But that time never seemed to come. Their children, Emma and James, felt their father's absence keenly. Emma, now a teenager, was beginning to navigate the challenges of adolescence without her father's guidance. She missed the days when Edward would take her out for ice cream after school or cheer her on at her soccer games. Now he was just a fleeting presence in her life, someone she saw at breakfast, and maybe, if she was lucky, at dinner on weekends. James, still a young boy, adored his father and tried to emulate him in every way. He would often sit at Edward's desk in the study, pretending to be on important business calls. But deep down, he wished his father would spend more time playing with him, like they used to. Despite the growing strain on his family, Edward remained oblivious. He was so consumed by his work that he failed to notice the sadness in Laura's eyes, the longing in Emma's voice, or the disappointment in James's small, hopeful gestures. To Edward, everything was fine because he was providing for his family, giving them a life of luxury and comfort. He believed that his success was their success, and as long as he was succeeding, they would be happy. But the truth was that his family didn't want his money or his success. They wanted him. They wanted the Edward who used to laugh with them, who would drop everything to go on a spontaneous adventure, who would listen to their stories and share his own. They wanted the husband and father they had lost to the demands of his business empire. One evening, as Edward was wrapping up another long day at the office, his assistant, Rebecca, walked in with a stack of mail. Among the usual bills and invitations was a plain white envelope, addressed to Edward in neat handwritten letters. Rebecca handed it to him, and he absent-mindedly tossed it onto his desk, too engrossed in the final touches of a major deal to give it any attention. It wasn't until much later that night, after everyone else had gone home and the city was quiet, that Edward noticed the envelope again. Something about its simplicity caught his eye. It was out of place among the sleek, formal correspondence he usually received. Curious, Edward picked it up and tore it open. As he unfolded the letter inside, his eyes skimmed over the words, his mind still half focused on the deal he had just closed. But then, a few lines in, his heart skipped a beat. He read it again, this time more slowly, as if the words were sinking into him with each passing second. Edward Hastings, the man who had always been in control, the man who never let anything shake him, felt the ground shift beneath him. The letter in his hands was not a typical piece of correspondence. It was a medical report, and it bore the kind of news that no one ever expects to receive. Edward's world, once so stable and secure, suddenly felt like it was spinning out of control. The letter said he had cancer, terminal cancer. The words echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. The office around him, once his sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the view outside, which he had always found inspiring, now seemed distant and cold. In that moment, Edward realized that everything he had worked for, all the success, the wealth, the power, meant nothing if he wasn't going to be around to enjoy it. The thought of leaving Laura, Emma, and James behind, of not being there to watch them grow and to share in their lives, was unbearable. For the first time in his life, Edward Hastings felt truly helpless. He had spent years building an empire, but now, faced with the prospect of his own mortality, he realized that he had neglected the most important part of his life, his family. The smile that had always been his trademark faded from his face, replaced by a look of profound sorrow. As he sat there alone in his office, the weight of his choices pressed down on him. Edward knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The man who had once been so full of life and energy now felt like a shadow of his former self. And as he stared at the letter in his hands, he knew that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The day had started like any other for Edward Hastings, the ever-smiling, ever-driven workaholic. He had woken up before dawn, as usual, and gone through his morning routine with precision. The early morning silence of his mansion, the crispness of his suit, the hum of his luxury car as it whisked him to his office. Everything was just as it always had been. Edward thrived in the predictability of his life, in the knowledge that every day brought new challenges to conquer and new victories to achieve. But this day, unbeknownst to him, would be different. By mid-morning, Edward was already deep into the flow of his work, surrounded by the buzz of his bustling office. His company was on the verge of closing a massive deal, one that would solidify his position as a titan of industry. The stakes were high, but Edward loved the pressure. It was what he lived for, the thrill of making the impossible happen, of turning dreams into reality. His mind was a whirlwind of strategies, negotiations, and contingencies, all spinning together to create a perfect storm of success. His assistant, Rebecca, quietly entered his office with a stack of documents. It was a routine she had perfected over the years, knowing exactly how to navigate Edward's intense focus without disrupting it. Among the contracts and reports was a plain white envelope, small and unassuming, almost lost in the pile of important papers. She placed it on his desk, just like she did with everything else, and left without a word, confident that Edward would attend to it when he had a moment. The envelope sat there for hours, untouched, as Edward continued to drive forward with his work. Meetings came and went, phone calls were made, and decisions were executed with the sharp precision that had become his trademark. He was in his element, completely engrossed in the game of business, unaware that his life was about to be turned upside down. It wasn't until late afternoon, when the office had quieted down and the last of his team had gone home, that Edward finally noticed the envelope. He picked it up, absent-mindedly inspecting it. There was nothing remarkable about it. No logo, no return address, just his name written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. His curiosity piqued. Edward tore it open, expecting it to be some mundane piece of correspondence. But as he pulled out the letter inside and began to read, the words hit him like a sledgehammer. The first thing that struck him was the official tone, the clinical language that left no room for ambiguity. It was a medical report, but not just any report. It was his medical report. His hands trembled slightly as he continued to read, his eyes widening in disbelief. The report detailed a series of tests, scans, and blood work, all pointing to the same conclusion. Cancer. Terminal cancer. The words seemed to leap off the page, searing themselves into his brain. Edward's mind raced, trying to make sense of it, to find some mistake, some explanation that didn't involve his impending death. But there it was, in black and white, a diagnosis that shattered the very foundation of his existence. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving him gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He read the letter again and then again, hoping that each new reading would somehow change the outcome. But the words remained the same, cold and unyielding. The letter was from a well-known hospital, one of the best in the country, and it was signed by a doctor whose name he recognized as a leading expert in oncology. There was no doubt, no room for error. The report was definitive. Edward slumped back in his chair, his body suddenly feeling as though it was made of lead. The once invincible businessman, the man who had always been in control, now felt powerless, vulnerable, and utterly terrified. He had spent his entire life building an empire, amassing wealth and power, but in the face of his own mortality, it all seemed meaningless. His thoughts turned to Laura, to Emma and James. How could he tell them? How could he shatter their world with this news? The idea of leaving them behind, of not being there to protect them, to guide them, was unbearable. His mind filled with images of Laura's face crumbling in grief, of Emma and James trying to comprehend a future without their father. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring the words on the letter. He had never felt so alone, so utterly lost. For years, Edward had been the pillar of strength for his family, the man who always had the answers, who could solve any problem. But now he was faced with something he couldn't fix, something he couldn't negotiate his way out of or buy his way around. He thought about all the time he had lost, all the moments he had missed with his family, the business trips, the late nights at the office, the endless meetings. Had any of it been worth it? Edward had always told himself that he was doing it for them, that he was working so hard to give them a better life. But now he wondered if he had been lying to himself, if he had been using his work as an excuse to avoid the messiness of real life, the vulnerability of real relationships. As he sat there, the weight of his regrets began to crush him. He had neglected the people who mattered most, believing that there would always be time to make things right. But now, time was the one thing he didn't have. The diagnosis was grim. Terminal, the letter had said. How long did he have? Months? Weeks? Days? The uncertainty gnawed at him, driving him to the brink of despair. Edward tried to imagine what it would be like to tell Laura, to sit her down and explain that he was dying. He could see the pain in her eyes, the disbelief, the anger. How could he do this to her, to the woman who had stood by him through everything? And what about the kids? How could he look Emma and James in the eye and tell them that their father wouldn't be there to watch them grow up? The thought of leaving them behind, of not being there for them, tore at his heart. He had always been so focused on providing for them financially, on making sure they had everything they could ever want. But what they wanted, what they needed, was him. And now, when they needed him the most, he was going to be taken away from them. As the hours dragged on, Edward felt himself slipping into a deep, dark place. He was a man who had always been in control, who had always been able to bend the world to his will. But now, faced with the ultimate challenge, he was helpless. The letter had robbed him of his sense of purpose, of his drive, of his will to keep fighting. For the first time in his life, Edward Hastings didn't know what to do. The office, once his refuge, now felt like a tomb. The silence was deafening, the darkness suffocating. Edward felt the walls closing in on him, the weight of his situation pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. He wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but he couldn't find the strength. All he could do was sit there, staring at the letter in his hands, his mind a swirling vortex of fear, regret, and despair. As the night wore on, Edward finally gathered the strength to leave his office. He walked out into the empty streets, the cold air biting at his skin. The city that had always felt so alive, so full of possibility, now seemed distant and uncaring. The lights of the skyscrapers, the hum of traffic, the buzz of life, all of it seemed meaningless. a stark contrast to the darkness that had settled over his soul. When he finally arrived home, Laura was already asleep. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her peaceful form under the covers, and felt a fresh wave of sorrow wash over him. How could he tell her? How could he break her heart like this? He knew that he couldn't keep it from her forever, but the thought of seeing her pain, of watching her world fall apart, was more than he could bear. Edward quietly slipped into bed beside her, his mind still reeling from the day's events. As he lay there in the darkness, his thoughts turned once again to his family. He knew that he had to tell them, but he didn't know how. All he knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The life they had known, the future they had planned, had been irrevocably changed by a single piece of paper. In the silence of the night, Edward Hastings wept. He wept for the life he had lived, for the choices he had made, and for the future that had been stolen from him. But most of all, he wept for the family he was about to leave behind. The man who had always been strong, who had always been in control, now felt utterly broken. And as he drifted off to sleep, the letter still clutched in his hand, he knew that the road ahead would be the hardest he had ever walked. The days following Edward's receipt of the devastating letter were a blur of darkness and despair. The once vibrant and energetic man, who had thrived on the challenges of his work and the demands of his success, was now a hollow shell of himself. The unshakable foundation of his life had crumbled beneath him, leaving him in a state of disbelief and hopelessness. From the moment he awoke each morning, Edward felt the crushing weight of his mortality bearing down on him. The bed that had once been his place of rest now felt like a prison, its sheets heavy with the burden of his thoughts. He would lie there for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to summon the will to start his day. His mind was consumed by the cold, clinical words of the letter, which echoed endlessly in his head. Terminal cancer. It was a death sentence, one that he had never imagined would be his. Laura, sensing that something was deeply wrong, tried her best to reach out to him. She would sit by his side, her voice gentle and full of concern, asking him what was wrong, but Edward couldn't bring himself to tell her. How could he burden her with such news? How could he destroy her world as his had been destroyed? The words caught in his throat, choking him with the fear and sadness that he couldn't express. All he could do was offer her a weak smile, one that didn't reach his eyes, and tell her that everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. Far from it. The office, once Edward's sanctuary, now felt like a foreign land. The bustling energy that had once fueled him now grated on his nerves. The endless stream of emails, meetings, and phone calls that had once been the lifeblood of his day now felt like meaningless noise. He would sit at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen, unable to focus on the tasks that had once brought him so much satisfaction. His mind, usually so sharp and decisive, was clouded with dread and despair. The staff at the office noticed the change in him immediately. The man who had always been the first to arrive and the last to leave was now late to meetings, his usual confident stride replaced with a sluggish shuffle. He no longer greeted his employees with his trademark smile, no longer engaged them with the warmth and enthusiasm they had come to expect. Instead, he was distant, withdrawn, his mind clearly elsewhere. Whispers began to circulate around the office, speculations about what could be troubling the seemingly invincible Edward Hastings. Edward's once robust appetite vanished. He would sit at the dinner table with his family, picking at his food, barely tasting it. The meals that Laura prepared with such care went untouched, the flavors and aromas lost on him. He couldn't bring himself to eat, couldn't bring himself to do anything that had once brought him joy. The vibrant colors of life had drained away, leaving everything in dull, lifeless shades of gray. Every evening, Edward would retreat to his study, closing the door behind him as if to shut out the world. He would sit there for hours, the lights dimmed, staring out the window into the darkness. His mind raced with thoughts of his impending death, of the things he would never get to do, the milestones he would never reach. He thought of his children, Emma and James, growing up without their father, missing out on the guidance and love he should have been there to give them. He thought of Laura, who had stood by him through everything, who had been his rock, his partner, and his love, now facing a future alone. His once luxurious study, filled with books, awards, and mementos of his achievements, now felt suffocating. The objects that had once been symbols of his success now seemed like mocking reminders of all that he would lose. The wealth, the power, the accolades, none of it mattered anymore. In the face of death, it was all meaningless. Desperate for answers, for some glimmer of hope, Edward visited several doctors over the course of the week. Each appointment was a grueling ordeal, filled with clinical detachment and cold, hard facts. He sat in sterile examination rooms, his heart pounding in his chest, as doctor after doctor confirmed the same diagnosis: terminal cancer. No mistake. No hope. Each time he heard those words, it felt like a fresh wound being carved into his soul. He asked questions, grasping at straws, trying to find some loophole, some miracle cure that could save him. But the doctors offered nothing but sympathy and the grim reality of his condition. There were treatments, of course, chemotherapy, radiation, but the prognosis was bleak. They could extend his life by a few months, maybe a year, but the end was inevitable. The cancer was aggressive, spreading rapidly. Time was not on his side. Edward left each appointment feeling more defeated than the last. The fear and sadness that had taken root in his heart now grew into full-blown despair. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been betrayed by his own body, by the life he had worked so hard to build. It all seemed so unfair, so cruel. How could this be happening to him? He had done everything right, hadn't he? He had worked hard, provided for his family, built an empire. So why was he being punished like this? The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Edward found himself questioning everything he had ever believed in, everything he had ever valued. His wealth, his accomplishments, his status. What did it all mean in the face of death? He had spent his entire life chasing success, but now, at the end of it all, he was left with nothing but regrets. Regrets for the time he had lost, for the moments he had missed, for the people he had pushed away in his relentless pursuit of more. He thought about his children, Emma and James, and the life he had given them. They had everything they could ever want: money, privilege, opportunities. But did they have what they needed? Did they have a father who had been there for them, who had supported them, who had loved them unconditionally? Edward had always told himself that he was working for them, that he was building a better future for his family. But now he wondered if he had been lying to himself, if he had been using his work as an excuse to avoid the messiness of real life, the vulnerability of real relationships. As the week wore on, Edward became more and more withdrawn. He stopped returning phone calls, stopped responding to emails. His office began to pile up with unfinished work, contracts waiting to be signed, deals waiting to be closed. But Edward couldn't bring himself to care. The drive, the ambition that had once fueled him, was gone, replaced by a crushing sense of futility. What was the point of it all if he was just going to die? What was the point of working, of building, of striving, if it was all going to end in nothingness? Laura watched her husband with growing concern, her heart breaking as she saw the man she loved slipping away. She tried to reach out to him, to comfort him, but Edward pushed her away. He couldn't let her see him like this, couldn't let her see the fear and weakness that had taken hold of him. He was supposed to be strong, supposed to be the one who held everything together. But now he felt like he was falling apart, and he didn't know how to stop it. One evening, as Edward sat alone in his study, he found himself staring at a photo of his family. It was a picture from a few years ago, taken during a rare family vacation. They were all smiling, standing on a beach, the sun setting behind them. Emma and James were laughing, their faces lit up with joy, while Laura stood beside him, her arm around his waist, her eyes full of love. Edward remembered that day, remembered how happy they had all been. But as he looked at the photo now, all he could see were the things he had missed, the moments he hadn't been there for, the times he had chosen work over family. Tears welled up in his eyes as he realized how much he had taken for granted. He had always thought there would be time to make things right, time to be the husband and father they deserved. But now, that time was slipping away, and he was powerless to stop it. The life he had built, the future he had envisioned, was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to save it. As the week came to an end, Edward found himself at his lowest point. He had lost all hope, all sense of purpose. The man who had once been so full of life, so driven and ambitious, was now a shadow of his former self. He had withdrawn from the world, from his work, from his family, consumed by the darkness of his thoughts. The future, once so bright and full of possibilities, now seemed bleak and meaningless. And so, Edward Hastings, the man who had always been in control, who had always been the master of his own destiny, found himself lost in a sea of despair, unable to see a way forward. The letter, that single piece of paper, had taken everything from him: his joy, his hope, his will to keep fighting. All that was left was the crushing weight of his mortality, a burden he didn't know how to bear. The week of despair had changed Edward in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. It had stripped him of everything he had thought was important, leaving him with nothing but the raw, painful truth of his own existence. And as he sat there, alone in the darkness, he couldn't help but wonder, what was the meaning of it all? What was the purpose of a life that ended in death? And most importantly, how would he spend the time he had left? The week had dragged on like an eternity for Edward Hastings, each day darker than the last. He had resigned himself to his fate, feeling the icy grip of death looming over him. But just as the despair threatened to consume him entirely, the phone rang. It was a call from the hospital, the same place that had delivered the devastating news that had turned his life upside down. With a sense of dread, Edward picked up the phone. His heart raced as he heard Dr. Roberts on the other end, asking him to come in for another consultation. The doctor's voice was calm, almost too calm, and it only served to heighten Edward's anxiety. What more could they possibly have to tell him? Was it even worse than he thought? A million thoughts raced through his mind, each one more terrifying than the last. He arrived at the hospital with his nerves on edge, his heart pounding in his chest. The sterile smell of antiseptic in the cold, fluorescent lighting seemed more oppressive than ever. The walk down the corridor to Dr. Roberts' office felt like a march to the gallows. Every step was heavy, every breath labored, as if the very air was conspiring to suffocate him. When he finally entered the office, Dr. Roberts was waiting for him, his expression serious but not unkind. The doctor gestured for Edward to sit down, and Edward did so, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the arms of the chair. The silence stretched out between them, thick with unspoken fears. "Edward," Dr. Roberts began, his voice measured, "I need to apologize. There has been a mistake." Edward's breath caught in his throat. A mistake? The word hung in the air, almost too unbelievable to grasp. His mind struggled to process what the doctor was saying, but he couldn't quite believe it. After all, the diagnosis had been so clear, so final. How could there be a mistake? Dr. Roberts continued, "The test results you received were not yours. They belonged to another patient with a similar name. I can't even begin to express how sorry I am for the distress this has caused you." For a moment, Edward was too stunned to respond. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of the doctor's words. Not his results? He didn't have cancer? It was like the world had shifted beneath his feet, leaving him disoriented, struggling to regain his balance. The reality of what Dr. Roberts was saying slowly began to sink in. Edward didn't have cancer. He wasn't dying. The relief that washed over him was almost too much to bear, so intense that it left him gasping for breath. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring his vision as the weight that had been crushing his soul for the past week was suddenly lifted. Edward's mind raced as he tried to process this new reality. The despair, the hopelessness, the fear of death that had consumed him, all of it had been based on a mistake. A terrible, agonizing mistake. He had been given a second chance, a reprieve from the death sentence he had believed was hanging over his head. The tears began to fall, hot and unchecked, streaming down his face as he buried his face in his hands. The sobs came then, deep and wrenching, as all the emotions he had been holding back for the past week poured out of him. Relief, joy, sorrow, anger, it all mixed together in a torrent of overwhelming emotion. Dr. Roberts waited patiently, giving Edward the time he needed to process the news. When Edward finally looked up, his eyes red and swollen from crying, The doctor continued speaking in a softer tone. "I can't imagine what you've been through, Edward, and I'm truly sorry for the pain this has caused. But you should know that you're in good health. There's nothing to worry about." The doctor's words were like a balm to Edward's soul, soothing the raw wounds that the week of despair had inflicted. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the good news, but for the life that he still had ahead of him, a life he had been ready to lose. As Edward left the hospital that day, he felt like a man reborn. The sky seemed bluer, the air fresher, the world more vibrant and full of life. The things he had taken for granted before, the simple pleasures of being alive, now seemed infinitely precious. The warmth of the sun on his face, the sound of birds singing, the laughter of children playing, everything was sharper, clearer, more meaningful. He drove home in silence, his mind awash with thoughts. The experience of the past week had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. He had faced the darkest depths of despair, had been forced to confront the reality of his own mortality, and had emerged on the other side with a new understanding of what truly mattered. When Edward arrived home, Laura was waiting for him, her expression a mixture of concern and hope. He had been so distant, so withdrawn over the past week, that she had barely recognized the man she loved. But now, as he walked through the door, she saw something different in his eyes, something she hadn't seen in a long time. Without a word, Edward crossed the room and took Laura in his arms, holding her close as if he never wanted to let go. She could feel the trembling in his body, the depth of the emotions that were coursing through him, and she held him just as tightly in return. "I don't have cancer," Edward whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It was a mistake, Laura. I'm not dying." Laura pulled back slightly, looking up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Are you serious? Edward, is it true?" He nodded, the tears spilling over again as he smiled through the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "It's true. I'm going to be okay." The relief that flooded Laura's face was palpable, and she let out a sob of her own, burying her face in his chest as the tears came. They stood there together, holding each other tightly, sharing in the overwhelming relief and gratitude for the second chance they had been given. In the days that followed, Edward found himself reflecting deeply on the experience he had just been through. The week of despair had shown him how fragile life truly was, how quickly everything he had built could be taken away. It had forced him to confront the reality of death, to face his fears and regrets head on. And in doing so, it had given him a new perspective on life, one that he knew he could never forget. He realized now that he had been living his life all wrong. He had been so focused on his work, on achieving success, that he had neglected the things that truly mattered, the people he loved, the simple joys of everyday life, the importance of being present in the moment. He had been chasing after wealth and status, thinking that they would bring him happiness. But in the end, they had only left him feeling empty and unfulfilled. Edward knew that he couldn't go back to the way things were before. The experience had changed him, had opened his eyes to what was truly important. He vowed to live his life differently from now on, to prioritize his family, to cherish the moments they had together, to focus on the things that brought him genuine joy and fulfillment. He began by spending more time with Laura, Emma, and James. He started taking them on trips, going to their school events, and simply being there for them in a way he hadn't before. He realized that the greatest gift he could give them was his time, his love, and his presence in their lives. At work, Edward made some changes as well. He scaled back his hours, delegated more responsibilities to his team, and focused on creating a better work-life balance. He wanted to be a role model not just for his family, but for his employees as well, showing them that success didn't have to come at the expense of happiness and well-being. Edward also made it a point to reach out to the people he had lost touch with over the years, old friends, distant relatives, even colleagues he had once been close to. He wanted to rebuild those connections, to let the people in his life know how much they meant to him. He realized now that relationships were the true measure of a successful life, not the money in his bank account or the accolades on his office wall. As the weeks turned into months, Edward found that he was happier than he had ever been. The fear of death had given him a newfound appreciation for life, and he was determined to make the most of every moment. He no longer took anything for granted, no longer let the little things pass him by. Every day was a gift, and he was going to live it to the fullest. The experience had also given Edward a new sense of purpose. He realized that he wanted to use his wealth and resources to help others, to make a positive impact on the world. He began donating to charities, supporting causes he believed in, and using his influence to create opportunities for those who needed it most. He wanted to leave a legacy that went beyond business success, a legacy of kindness, compassion, and generosity. Looking back, Edward knew that the week of despair had been the most difficult experience of his life, but it had also been the most transformative. It had forced him to confront his own mortality, to face the reality of his life, and to make the changes that were necessary to truly live. And for that, he was profoundly grateful. Edward Hastings, the man who had once been consumed by his work, who had once measured his worth by his achievements, had been reborn. He was now a man who valued relationships over riches, who cherished every moment with his family, and who lived each day with a deep sense of gratitude and purpose. And as he sat in his office, looking out at the city skyline, Edward smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace with himself and the life he was living. The truth had been revealed, and it had set him free. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the story and share any themes or ideas you'd like to hear in future stories. Your feedback means the world to me. Thanks for watching.